I have to wipe my brow because it's getting a little warm in this room. Winnie, forgive me for being human here.
Oh, listen, you know how I feel about you. I've already told you.
Oh, thank you.
You provide this beautiful book review that makes me feel smart.
Great. Here we go. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. I'm talking to some of the people behind this year's Oscar-nominated films adapted from books.
The borderline.
Who wrote this?
He did.
And today I'm here with Winnie Holzman. Winnie has been on a very interesting journey the past couple decades, many years after creating the beloved Claire Danes TV series, My So-Called Life. Winnie wrote the book, the script, for the musical Wicked, which tells the story of Elphaba and Galinda, the characters who we used to know as the Wicked Witch of the West and Glinda, the Good Witch of the North. And 2 or so decades after working on Wicked, which is now one of the highest-grossing Broadway musicals of all time, Winnie found herself back at it, co-writing the screenplay for the film version. Starring Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande, Wicked has received 10 Oscar nominations, including 1 for Best Picture. Winnie, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Oh, it's so good to be here, Gilbert.
So, Winnie, Wicked, the musical, is based on the 1995 Gregory Maguire book of the same name, which was based on the L. Frank Baum novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is a book that formed the basis for the 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz.
Exactly.
One of the most beloved American movies of all time. It's quite a tangled web of connections and adaptations, all telling their own versions of this basic story. I'd love to start with the one that I think so many of us saw as a kid. Tell me about the first time that you saw Dorothy and Toto in The Wizard of Oz.
Well, that beloved movie, The Wizard of Oz, really shaped our generation because when it would appear on TV, near to holiday time, it was an event. And back then there were 5 channels and you couldn't just watch any movie. In fact, I can remember the very first time I watched it, we had a black and white TV. So I hadn't even seen yet this incredible effect when she arrives at Oz and everything becomes color. It was something Stephen and I talked about endlessly during the writing of Wicked, because for both of us, we revere that movie as a great American piece of art.
Gregory Maguire's book first came out in 1995. When did you read it for the first time?
Well, I saw it in a bookstore in New York City. I live in Los Angeles, but I was visiting New York. I think it was at Shakespeare and Company. I remember seeing the cover of that book. That edition had a girl with a green face, but it's half covered by her big black hat. And you can see that her face is green, and it's called Wicked. And when I turned it over and read the little précis on the back, it said, blew my mind. I thought it was such a brilliant premise. And so I bought the book, but I never read it. And I was wondering if I could maybe make it into a movie, get the rights. Mm-hmm. When I found out the rights were unavailable, I never read it. And in fact, people will not believe this, but it literally sat on my shelf, but not with the spine pointing out, with the cover pointing out, because I loved that cover. And I used to stare at it when I was sitting in my writing room. It's kind of cool and spooky, actually, because it was a presence in my room.
What did you think about it when you read it for the first time? Were there things in it, scenes, moments in your mind you said, I can see this. I can see this being on stage, or I can see it being somewhere else?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Stephen asked me to read it when he was saying to me, basically, I think you might be the right person for me to write this with.
And this is Stephen Schwartz, the composer and lyricist who worked on Godspell, worked on Pippin.
Pippin.
So he came to you.
Our paths had crossed actually a few times in life. And he knew I had written a musical when I was younger. I had actually written a musical when I was in my 20s and early 30s in New York. He lives in Connecticut and I live in Los Angeles. So in the beginning, a lot of it was on the phone. And we both were so taken with this brilliant idea of Gregory's that the Wicked Witch of the West and Glinda the Good Witch had actually been college roommates. I mean, that's just genius. And it was the kind of thing that we knew immediately that would be in the musical. Reading the novel, it's episodic, it's dense, and it's got a tone that's quite dark. Stephen and I our personalities, there is darkness in our musical for sure, but we just knew that we were going to take a slightly different angle, a vibe, you might say. We were in the middle of writing it and casting it when 9/11 happened. And that was an influence as well.
How do you think the events of 9/11 influenced the work that you were doing on it?
There was a lot of lying about weapons of mass destruction, a lot of casting of blame, pointing of fingers, ostracizing of Muslim people. And that was immediate. But we were in the middle of writing a story. Gregory's novel is very political. It is about a fascistic leader, a person who has conned the country into believing certain things about them that aren't true. In order to stay in power, he has othered, you might say, to use the contemporary language, he has othered the animals of Oz to help him gather his own power and keep his own power. And that's all in the novel. And we knew we were going to use that. There was an escalation of intensity, politically in the country suddenly with 9/11. And it couldn't help but work its way into our musical. It wasn't until now with the movie and with what's happened in the world and in our country that people are starting to realize, looking at the movie, oh, this has really got political content. But it's always been the same content.
Winnie, as you just said, Wicked is a surprisingly dense book. If you haven't sort of had, if our listeners haven't had the opportunity to read it, and you talked about, alighting on the fact that having Elphaba and Galinda be college roommates was just a wonderful jumping off point.
Yes.
How else were you able to sort of find a through line through the thicket of everything that happens in that book to come up with something that in the musical and I think in the film version is an emotional through line?
Well, I think that's what we just seek naturally as writers, both Stephen Schwartz and I. How do we give the audience an emotional experience? I want to just double back for a second about Gregory's novel. One of the things that really struck me reading it was I felt like I was really there. I felt like I was really in Oz. He provides these amazing details. So when you're reading the novel, you're really feeling like, oh my goodness, Oz is a real place and it has a real culture. I wanted to give that feeling, but I also wanted a little bit more of what you get in the movie, probably because of the movie meant so much to me and to Stephen Schwartz. That feeling of buoyancy, the sort of the level of wish fulfillment, like if only I could live in Oz.
Now, a couple decades have passed, but I get the feeling that the idea of Wicked as a movie, certainly following its success on Broadway, was always sort of lurking in the background.
You are so right.
In some way.
You have the right feeling. It was always lurking because our producers on Broadway, some of our producers were a film company, a movie company. So, and they had been trying to create a movie from Gregory's novel that was going to be a non-musical, non-singing and music movie, right? So, so when our show on Broadway was pretty successful, it was one of the first things that we knew was coming. And for us, the real thing was, what's the rush? Because we had a show that was running on Broadway and was touring and also opening up in cities around the world. There was no motivation to hurry, hurry, hurry.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea wasn't to rush out a movie. The whole idea was, if we were going to have a movie, to have it be incredibly, have something that we could be really proud of. And in order for that to happen, we had to really kind of clear our minds and open our minds and kind of reconceive the whole story.
Do you consider this to be a re-adaptation? You're essentially adapting your own adaptation? Is it? I mean, it's a little bit of you're sort of falling into the rabbit hole. But how did you start to think about taking?
That's another story.
Yeah, no, you're right. About taking your own work and conceiving it for an entirely different medium.
I really felt intimidated sometimes, but also honored, because let's face it, a lot of writers don't get to write the movie. Somebody else gets brought in. So I was very lucky. I still feel lucky to be the one that was allowed to stay with it. And my job became to really act as if I was brought in. Nothing was precious. Nothing couldn't be examined and re-examined and rethought and redone. I really sincerely meant that. And I mean, when I say we ended up doing it so collaboratively. I mean, myself, John Chu, who's amazing, and he brought in Dana Fox, who he'd worked with recently, and she and I worked together. This was during the pandemic, and we actually, all of us only worked on Zoom together, and we never met in person until after the movies were written.
Wow.
Everything was done remotely. And John Chu, he made his mark. He had very strong feelings about Wicked, the musical. He loves it. And he saw it as a young man when he was about 20 years old, a USC film student. So he was seeing a very clunkified, primitive version of Wicked that was before we rewrote it to open on Broadway. But it was still Wicked, and he fell in love with it.
You're referring to John Chu, the director of Wicked and the forthcoming sequel, Wicked for Good. I'd love for you to, if you can, talk in specifics about, moments that you wanted to expand from the musical to the movie, or moments that did not exist in the musical because of various constraints that you were able finally to bring to life.
Sure. Well, I mean, a big one, that the movie should start at the scene of the crime. That's what we called it, the scene of the crime, which is the murder of the Wicked Witch. Mm-hmm. So, we always thought of panning into that castle and seeing the overturned bucket of water, the puddle. And then John took that so much further. You're seeing something, you don't know what it is. It turns out to be a drop of water, which is the murder weapon, quote unquote. So even from the beginning, you see that we're playing with the idea of the story. And then when the monkeys explode out of that castle, you pan down and you see the witch hunters. We call them the witch hunters. You see the figures from the back of fleeing, their crime scene.
Yeah, Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion.
Correct. And they're headed toward Munchkinland. Obviously, that's something we would never have been able to do on stage.
When you're working on the screenplay, did you have to come to terms with the fact that, given that so much of this movie is about the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda, you could actually express emotion in a way in film that you cannot in theater, because someone sitting in the mezzanine cannot see a person's face, the emotion on their face, close up in the way that you can in a film when you're looking at Cynthia Erivo getting emotional about something? Is that something that you have to bake into the screenplay?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you want to be giving opportunity for those moments. And I think they simply took them in many cases. Mm-hmm. In other words, those two actresses who are so remarkable, they're really so expressive. So there's so much going on in their eyes with both of them. And they're so obviously gorgeous singers. They're masterful, but they really understood these characters. And I think that John always made room for them to, he made sure he was in there capturing. It's interesting because, of course, the musical itself on stage is emotional. People find it emotional. They laugh, they cry, they get involved. We've had fans for over 20 years in different cultures too. So it's not like I was looking at it going, well, this is my big moment to try to get an emotional reaction, because it's not like we hadn't had an emotional reaction, but we knew that it could be widened out. And that was a big motivation for me, that I wanted to include people who might think that theater isn't for them.
I'm curious, given how long Wicked has run on Broadway and in all of the cities in which it has toured, and it was very popular in London and lots of other cities, you've developed this sort of rabid fan base. People have gone back and seen it multiple times,
yes,
and are so attached to it. How did you sort of grapple with the fact that as you adapted this from stage to screen, all of those people are going to have various opinions on anything that you did?
Well, I mean, I was scared. I was scared, Gilbert.
Aw.
Wouldn't you have been scared?
Yes, I'm scared right now listening to you tell me the story.
It's intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
It's intimidating. But in order to do anything that you present to people in any way, you have to go to a private place and say to yourself, I'm going to do what feels right to me. I mean, what else can I do? I'm going to use my own instincts. I'm going to be my own audience, which is how I write everything, which is how Stephen Schwartz writes everything. We all had this belief that this was an opportunity to go deeper with these characters. So, first of all, I'm not on social media. Thank Oz. But there's a lot of opinions floating around. But that's true of anything you write. That in a way, even if you don't have a quote unquote fan base, you're always. If you chose to, you could be frightened every minute, because what are people going to say? What are people going to think? What is my family going to think? What are people that are strangers going to think? How badly am I going to embarrass myself this time? If you've been successful, now the success will be taken away. If you've never been successful, this is your big moment to really fail. I mean, there's always something to be scared of. And I just have lived with that my whole entire life, just trying to create things. Mm-hmm. So it is something I think that is a power that you can harness. I really did want people to have a great experience, or at least an interesting experience, an experience that had some merit. And I can't do that if I'm constantly taking a poll.
I'd love to talk about the end of the movie. I don't think we're spoiling something. So many people have seen this, and it has to do.
Everyone.
A lot of people have seen it, and it has to do with arguably one of the most famous songs in the modern Broadway canon, which is "Defying Gravity." It's the big number at the end of Act 1 in the musical. And in the movie, it's sort of elongated, expanded. It plays out over the last 15 or so minutes of the film. It's basically its own chapter of the story. It has interstitial scenes, multiple locations.
Right.
Just talk to me as a screenwriter, as a writer, in as much detail as you can about how you take that one song and this thing that has been staged and presented in this one way for so long, and you just sort of like blow it out to this to make it this giant showstopper in a different way at the end of the film.
We're actually saying we want you to want to see the rest of the story. This isn't the end of our story. It's movie language, to sort of go back and go through that land of Oz and show all the people of her life that's going to be affected by this revelation, this incredibly courageous choice she's making. You could say dangerous choice. Stephen and John really carefully figured out ways to elongate that song. We didn't want to do anything that might harm the song, if you see what I mean.
I do.
We wanted to rethink all the time. We were always rethinking, but we didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to accidentally lose the kernel of what's making it emotional in the first place.
You alluded to the second film, Wicked for Good.
I can allude, but I cannot speak
I was just going to
further.
say, I doubt there's much you could say about what's coming, but...
Not if I want to live a happy life.
Can you talk about the moment when you as a group realized, okay, this is going to take much longer to tell this story in a cinematic way than we did on stage?
Sure. I mean, I was very reluctant personally. My fear was that it might lose the impact of the story.
Mm-hmm.
The story is built to take you all the way to the end. What really moved me to understand why it was going to work so well was that when John came in, John Chu, he felt very confident. That was combined with the fact that Stephen and I, we really didn't want to cut any of the numbers. We felt that people would be disappointed to see numbers cut. And we personally didn't want to cut any numbers. So if you're not going to cut any numbers, but you're going to expand and deepen the relationships, the moments, you're going to allow for cinematic time, you know what I mean? For John to do his beautiful shots, which takes time, right? And Stephen wanted to write 2 new songs because there are moments in the second movie that he and I both felt could be musicalized. And so we want to take all this time to develop, show the childhood. I left out the animals before, but we show more of the animals, and their situation and how they're being persecuted. So we needed time for all of this. Where's the time going to come if we're not cutting any numbers? Because the first movie is really Elphaba's coming into her own, finding her voice, and stepping into her true destiny. And that is done through her friendship with Glinda in some ways, but that is really her journey. Then in the second movie, though Elphaba is hugely, vitally, crucially important, Glinda herself does a similar thing. She steps into her true destiny. She discovers her true destiny. And so when that became clear, it became much easier for me to realize that I could feel an integrity about making it 2 movies.
I want to end by asking you about your cameo in the film. You not only were involved in sort of developing and putting together this giant film production, but I assume over 1 or 2 days you actually found yourself in the cyclone, in the tornado of a big budget film. What was it like to be on set?
Oh, it was really fun. I mean, this was John Chu's idea that Stephen and I would make cameos in the movie. And I brought my daughter, which made it so much fun. And we went to London, and those amazing costumes that Paul Tazewell put together, and my hair that looks like soft serve ice cream. I mean, my wig.
Did you get to keep any part of the costume?
I did not. I didn't even ask. I was way too shy to ask for the costume.
There are moments when you use your authority as the writer of this entire thing and say, I would like to keep this green frock.
I guess I should have, but I didn't. And, John was directing me. He was like, could you do it again? Just look over there.
Now you know the life of a modern actor. Look at this tennis ball.
Exactly. It's not that easy. It's not that easy.
Winnie Holzman, co-writer of Wicked, the film adaptation, writer of Wicked, the hit Broadway musical. Thank you so much for joining the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you. I loved it. It was really fun to meet you.
No, it was a pleasure to have you on.